The Restless Camper. The forest opened before him like a shadowed cathedral, its spines of pine and oak stretching high into a sky littered with stars. He had driven hours to reach this clearing, a narrow break in the dense Appalachians, where sunlight had long since receded, leaving only the pale glow of evening. Setting the tent between two gnarled trees, he worked with the practiced motions of someone used to solitude, hammering stakes and drawing taut the fabric until it hummed softly in the crisp night air. The fire sparked reluctantly at first, the smell of dry wood curling up, mingling with the faint, earthy scent of damp soil and pine needles. There was a rhythm to it, a calm routine, each step measured, grounding. The night felt alive, yet ordinary, like countless nights spent beneath stars that had always been there. He sat on a folded chair, stretching his legs, listening to the soft sigh of the wind against the pines. Somewhere in the distance, the creek murmured, a gentle undercurrent to the whispering leaves. The forest seemed impossibly quiet, too quiet, the way the world holds its breath just before dawn. A crow cawed somewhere beyond the ridge, but it felt isolated, as if it were the only movement in a tableau frozen by time. He told himself it was nothing, that this was the stillness of solitude, the peace he had chased all the way out here. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed with little change, until a faint sound brushed the edges of his awareness. A snap of twig, irregular, out of rhythm with the wind, echoed just beyond the firelight. He froze, heart tightening. The sound came again, soft and deliberate, almost like the pacing of someone circling the perimeter, though the clearing appeared empty. His flashlight traced arcs across the trees, catching the swaying of branches and the glint of distant rocks, but no figure emerged. No shadow lingered long enough to define itself. The breeze whispered through the needles, carrying the smell of damp earth and resin, yet under it was something metallic, cold, almost antiseptic, a scent that didn't belong here. He shook his head, dismissing it. Fatigue had a way of shaping fear into phantom movement, yet the sound continued, irregular, unpatterned, and always just outside reach. It wrapped around him, threading the trees, slipping between branches, impossible to locate. Every glance over his shoulder made the darkness feel heavier, the shadows deeper, as if the forest itself had leaned in to watch. The stars, once comforting, now seemed distant, pinpricks of light above a world that had suddenly grown too vast, too indifferent. Hours crept forward, and the night pressed against him, cold and alive. The fire's glow threw golden limbs across the clearing, yet the edges remained obsidian black. Shapes of rock and root became ambiguous, hiding things that weren't there, or things he could not see. A faint movement, or perhaps a trick of light, darted at the corner of his vision, gone before he could focus. The wind rose slightly, carrying with it a whisper, unintelligible, barely more than a rustle. He leaned closer to the fire, pulling his jacket tighter, trying to ignore the sensation that he was being measured, circled, catalogued. Sleep came in uneven breaths, fitful, always interrupted by the low, irregular sounds from the tree line. Each step beyond the clearing seemed to echo against some invisible boundary, returning to him as a soft tap or scratch. The forest had its own rhythm, a pulse he could sense in the hollow of his chest, and for the first time he realized the stillness was not empty, it was attentive. Even as he finally sank into a restless doze, the clearing did not release him. The trees loomed, the fire flickered, and the wind whispered its unknown language. Something unseen paced just beyond sight, patient, waiting, as if aware of every motion he made, every breath he drew. And in the shadows, the night held itself apart from the ordinary world, stretching longer, folding over itself, promising that this was only the first hour of a long vigil the forest intended him to endure. The night deepened around him, settling like a thick invisible blanket over the clearing. Sleep teased him in uneven waves, but it never fully claimed him. Every rustle of needles or snap of twig made him start, heart hammering as though the forest itself had synchronized with his pulse. The footsteps began softly at first, almost imperceptible, circling the tent with a rhythm that never fully repeated. Tap, pause, scrape, shuffle, always somewhere just beyond the reach of the firelight, never near enough to see but never far enough to ignore Dot. He swung his flashlight across the clearing, its beam slicing through darkness in jittery arcs. Each sweep revealed nothing, just the familiar outline of trees, the rocks he had memorized, the low embers of the dying fire. Yet the sound continued, deliberate, intelligent, as if it knew exactly where he would look next. Every time he tried to step outside, the forest seemed to shift, subtly, almost playfully, rearranging the space around him. He could feel it pressing in, the weight of unseen eyes in every shadow, a constant, low thrum that made his ears ring. He crouched, straining to listen, heart hammering so loudly he could almost hear it in the canopy above. The steps circled closer, then farther, teasing him. A predator learning the limits of its prey. He called out once, his voice cracking against the dark, but no answer came. Only the footsteps, continuing their erratic rotation, accompanied now by a soft metallic hiss, like breath drawn through teeth or perhaps the shifting of rocks under some invisible weight. He could not tell. Every instinct screamed that he should leave, yet his body froze, trapped by curiosity, fear, and the unbearable tension of not knowing what stalked him. He checked the tent repeatedly, lifting flaps and peering into the shadows at the corners, finding nothing. No footprints, no indication of life, yet the items he had left inside, his water bottle, a flashlight, a notebook, felt subtly shifted each time. The air carried a metallic tang now, faint but sharp, mingling with the scent of pine and wet soil. His breath fogged in the cool night, the exhale shaking as he moved to readjust the fire. Its glow flickered, casting shapes that seemed almost humanoid in the periphery, twisting and vanishing when he turned fully to face them. Time stretched, unmeasured. Minutes lost meaning. Hours folded into a rhythm dictated by the steps that never ceased. Tap, pause, shuffle, always circling, always observing. He tried to convince himself it was an animal, a fox or raccoon, or perhaps a deer, moving with a strange intelligence. But the sounds were too deliberate, too coordinated, too aware of his movements. It was no forest creature he knew, no logic applied. Somewhere in the darkness, whatever moved was studying him, testing him, weaving him into a pattern he could not yet see. Fatigue began to blur the edges of perception. Shadows deepened unnaturally, and for a brief instant he thought the fire had grown larger, stretching its glow along the tree line, illuminating shapes crouched among the trees. When he blinked, it was gone. Only the footsteps remained, circling closer, closer, until he felt them press against the thin canvas of the tent. The floor beneath him seemed to vibrate with their motion. He froze, gripping his flashlight, listening to the irregular rhythm, as if the night itself had learned to breathe with him. He tried again to sleep, closing his eyes against the tension that coiled through every nerve. Every time his mind drifted, the steps shifted, matching his heartbeat, following his involuntary movements. He began to sense a pattern, a deliberate timing, a pause when he froze, a scrape when he moved. It was as if the forest were teasing him, mapping him, cataloging his reactions in real time. The stars overhead, once so distant, now felt like watching eyes, small pinpricks of light bearing witness to his helplessness. By the darkest hour, just before the faintest edge of pre-dawn light, he understood with a shiver that the forest had not merely observed him, it had engaged him. It was aware of him in ways that defied explanation, surrounding him with an invisible, intelligent presence. And though no figure ever revealed itself, the footsteps continued, relentless and unnerving, leaving him to wonder if the forest would ever let him go, or if he had already become part of its eternal pattern. The night had deepened into something thick and viscous, the forest closing in like a living thing around the small tent. Each time he blinked, the shadows seemed to stretch, forming shapes at impossible angles, as if the darkness itself were studying him. Inside, the tent felt wrong, though at first he couldn't name why. His gear, pens, maps, water bottles, had always been laid with care, each item in its place. Now, every time he glanced away and back again, something had shifted. Just slightly. A pen moved an inch, a map slid across the floor, a bottle rolled as if nudged by an unseen hand dot. He froze, staring at the firelight's tremble on the canvas, heart hammering. The shadows cast by the flames didn't align with the objects themselves. They stretched long and thin, contorting in impossible ways, angles that no light should have formed. His stomach tightened. The movements were subtle, easily dismissed if he didn't look too closely. But he couldn't stop looking. Each shift carried a precision, a deliberate intelligence that whispered of a presence just beyond his senses. Outside, the forest remained unnervingly still. The wind had died entirely, and the rustle of leaves or pine needles had vanished, leaving only the soft scrape of the earth under unseen footsteps. He dared a glance through the tent flap, flashlight sweeping slowly across the clearing, but nothing moved. The rocks, the trees, the low brush, all lay in perfect stillness. Yet a sense of pressure pressed in from the surrounding darkness, subtle but undeniable, like the forest itself was bending inward, observing, circling him in silence. Every sound became amplified. The soft crackle of the dying fire felt like it echoed through the woods. His own breath, shallow and quick, sounded like footsteps pacing alongside the tent, and when he dared to move, to rearrange something that had shifted, the forest seemed to respond. A twig cracked in the distance, precisely timed with the motion of his hand. The air held a metallic tang, faint but sharp, mingling with the earthy scent of moss and wet soil. He realized with a creeping dread that nothing here obeyed normal rules anymore. Not wind, not shadows, not light. Dot time blurred. Minutes and hours folded together into a rhythm dictated by the silent presence. Every glance outside the tent hinted at movement that vanished the instant he focused. The firelight flickered across the tent walls, projecting shapes that felt almost human, crouched just beyond the veil of vision. His gear continued to shift, more insistently now, as if cataloging him, testing him, or communicating in a language he could not understand. He dared not touch the objects anymore, fearing that to interfere would invite something closer, something that had remained patient and unseen all night. A sudden thought struck him. What if the forest did not merely observe, but shape reality around him? Each move he made, each breath, each glance, seemed to ripple across the tent and clearing. Patterns formed in the shadows, as if invisible fingers sketched them in real time. The objects themselves felt like markers, tokens of attention or measurement, subtle yet deliberate. He tried to rationalize, to convince himself it was exhaustion, paranoia, or the isolation pressing on his mind. But logic felt inadequate here, fragile and useless. Dot. He lay down briefly, the canvas brushing cold against his skin, listening to the hollow rhythmic quiet that had replaced the footsteps of earlier hours. Every so often, a small object shifted with a soft scrape against the floor. The subtle sound pierced the heavy night, a reminder that the forest's presence lingered closer than the tree line could suggest. He could feel it circling him, calculating, patient. It never revealed itself, but its awareness was undeniable, pressing against him in a way that made his pulse stutter. By the hour before dawn, the realization settled with the weight of stone. He was not alone in the clearing. Not simply observed, not simply haunted, but entangled in a pattern he could not see or escape. Every object shifted under invisible hands. Every shadow stretched to impossible lengths, and the forest, silent and still, held him within its unseen, deliberate grasp. And though he could not confront it, could not name it, he understood with a deep, sinking certainty that whatever circled him had already begun to map him, to fold him into its own rhythm, and there was no moment, not even now, when he was free. The wind began softly at first, carrying the scent of wet pine and cold earth, but beneath it there was something else, a murmur that didn't belong to the forest. He paused mid-step, listening. The rustle of branches seemed deliberate, as though forming words, but each syllable dissolved before he could understand. It felt like the air itself was alive, leaning close to speak secrets he wasn't meant to hear. Twigs snapped in a rhythm he couldn't follow, pacing circles around the tent. Sometimes the sounds came from multiple directions at once, converging and retreating, testing him, calling him, yet revealing nothing. Every instinct told him to leave, to run blindly down the trail, but some part of him remained frozen, straining to decipher the pattern, to catch the source of the voice. The forest pressed close, suffocating in its silence between the murmurs. The trees seemed to bend subtly toward him. Branches arched overhead like arms poised to touch, moss dangling in unnatural swirls. He noticed the ground around the tent was no longer random. Small depressions formed in arcs, faint impressions that repeated with geometric precision, circling him like a ritual. Shadows shifted in the corners of his vision, always just beyond clarity, forming angles that suggested figures crouched or peering. He could not confirm anything, yet the sense of eyes unseen, watching every move, gnawed at his mind. Occasionally, a louder whisper threaded through the air, rising above the background hum. It wasn't words exactly, but it carried intent, a cadence that mirrored his own thoughts. He felt the edges of his consciousness fray, the distinction between forest and self blurring. Even his flashlight, held tightly in trembling hands, seemed to bend the shadows in response, revealing shapes that were gone the instant he blinked. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was fatigue. Imagination stretched thin by isolation, yet the evidence persisted. Moss on fallen logs appeared rearranged, forming angles that hinted at fingers or limbs. Rocks he had stepped over earlier seemed nudged, placed in deliberate orientation along the perimeter. Every element of the clearing had been subtly altered overnight, yet he had no memory of intervening. The forest was writing a language he could not read, cataloging his presence in ways he could neither control nor resist. Time lost meaning. The whispers rose and fell like waves, circling and folding back on themselves. Each gust of wind carried them closer, and yet no one appeared. The forest breathed around him, alive in a quiet rhythm that he could feel through the soles of his boots. He realized the wind itself was part of the pattern, moving not randomly but with purpose, carrying hints of voice and motion that threaded into a larger, unseen design. Dot. By the edge of dawn, the whispers faded, leaving only the rustle of normal leaves and the faint echo of what might have been footsteps. He crouched beside the tent, trying to make sense of the night, but every element of the clearing now seemed deliberate. Trees, moss, rocks, even the angles of the fire's ashes from hours before. The forest had been attentive, patient, cataloging him silently, leaving subtle signatures of its observation. He understood, in that quiet moment, that nothing here was random. The wind remembered his presence. The whispers carried memory, and the forest itself had been alive in a way he could not confront or escape. He had survived the night, yet he was no longer merely a visitor. He was marked, folded into something vast, patient, and aware. Even as sunlight began to touch the trees, the feeling persisted. He had been watched, measured, and catalogued, and the forest would not soon forget. Dawn came slowly, stretching pale light across the clearing, but it brought no comfort. The fire had burned down to soft gray ash, yet something about it felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. He knelt beside the smoldering remains, and his stomach dropped as he realized the pattern. The ashes and embers had been arranged into shapes, vaguely humanoid, lying prone across the dirt in silent testimony. Each outline was precise, measured, and horrifyingly deliberate, as if someone, or something, had been watching every movement he made through the night and recorded it here. He rose, trying to shake the unease, telling himself the shapes were coincidence, the mind playing tricks after hours of tension. Yet the footprints around the tent denied that comfort. There were dozens, circling in arcs, sometimes overlapping, sometimes elongated, distorted in ways human feet could never leave. Some were tiny, almost childlike, others impossibly long, as if the earth itself had stepped. None matched his own boots. He stared at them, tracing each line with his eyes, feeling an invisible gaze pressing down from the surrounding forest. It was not observation. It was documentation. His gear, water bottles, spare blankets, the scattered pens and maps he had checked during the night, had been moved. They were arranged in relation to the ash outlines, forming lines that connected the figures like constellations on the ground. He bent to pick up his camera, the one he had been using to document the ridge, thinking perhaps it had captured some clue to the night's events. But the memory card told a story even more unsettling. Each frame recorded the clearing as if frozen in place, yet the patterns were always slightly shifted, subtly alive. Faces pressed against the lens appeared in some shots, eyes wide, mouths frozen in silent scream, staring through the barrier of reality. He could not recall taking the photos. He did not recognize the faces. He backed away from the tent, heart hammering in his chest. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet the forest had changed around him. Angles were wrong. Distances seemed longer than they had been before. The ridge itself felt less like a place and more like a cage, contours shifting with subtle intent. He noticed the shadows beneath the remaining embers, longer, darker, stretching toward him in silent accusation. The forest had recorded him, catalogued him, and in that act, it had altered his world, leaving him unmoored from the path he thought he knew. He crouched beside the largest human-shaped pattern, touching the ash lightly with a trembling finger. It was cold despite the fire's embers, granular under his touch. The lines did not crumble or smear. They remained perfect, intact. Every movement he made seemed anticipated, every footstep already marked in a history he had not yet lived. A shiver ran through him as he realized he was not alone. Not physically, perhaps, but present in a way that the forest could perceive, could record, could replay. The night had not ended. It had only paused, leaving evidence of its work in shapes, shadows, and the unnatural footprints that surrounded him. He looked up at the surrounding trees, their branches now catching the first light of morning, and for a moment he swore he saw them bend slightly, as though leaning closer to study the tableau he had uncovered. The air was still, the soft wind absent, but he felt it. The weight of unseen attention, quiet but pressing, as if the forest itself breathed around him. The clearing was not empty. It never had been. It had been alive all along, cataloging, recording, remembering every motion, every hesitation, every glance he had cast into the dark dot. Stepping back, he realized the truth. He had been observed, measured, and preserved in the memory of the forest. The ash patterns, the footprints, the displaced objects, all were proof. And though sunlight now touched the ridge, it offered no comfort. The forest would not forget him. It would carry the memory forward, replaying it in subtle distortions for anyone who came after. He had survived the night, but in doing so he had become part of a story that was older, patient, and unyielding. Something in the clearing had recorded him as it did all visitors, a quiet, insidious witness, leaving him with the knowledge that the forest remembered far longer than he ever could. Packing his gear, he tried to convince himself the night was over, that the forest had finally released him. The morning air was crisp, sunlight filtering through the high canopy in golden shafts, but nothing looked right. The clearing felt subtly altered. Distances stretched and angles shifted. Paths he remembered taking seemed longer, steeper, as though the earth itself had been quietly rearranged while he slept. Every step toward the trailhead made him feel smaller, as if the forest was expanding around him, keeping him in its gaze. The patterns in the ash remained, unchanged, even under the bright light of day. He glanced back and saw them clearly. Human shapes meticulously arranged, lines connecting objects as if the clearing itself had tried to map his every movement. Footprints lingered where they had been overnight, each one familiar yet impossible, a record of actions he had not consciously taken. The ground seemed to pulse softly beneath his boots, a slow, rhythmic reminder that he had not been merely observed. He had been integrated into the forest's memory, catalogued like a specimen in some patient, unseen archive dot. The forest seemed alive in ways he could not explain. Branches arched unnaturally toward the clearing, shadows stretched longer than they should, and a subtle hum, almost like a low vibration, ran through the soil. His gear felt heavier in his hands, his camera buzzing faintly as if trying to warn him. He dared a glance at the memory card, and the images confirmed what he already suspected. The forest had recorded not just his presence, but his absence, creating frames of moments he could not have witnessed. Faces pressed against the lens stared back, eyes wide, accusing, silent screams frozen midair. The ridge remembered him. It had imprinted him into its own rhythm, and it would not release him entirely. He moved towards the trailhead, each step deliberate, yet he felt it, the weight of invisible attention brushing against him. Branches swayed without wind, and small stones shifted underfoot as if nudged by unseen fingers. He tried to rationalize, telling himself exhaustion and imagination were conspiring against him, but every subtle shift, every unnatural angle contradicted that logic. Something in the clearing had rewritten his sense of space. Something had marked him. Dot locals had warned of these woods, spoke in hushed tones about the rearranging that occurred when someone lingered too long. He had dismissed it as folklore, campfire stories for gullible hikers. But now, as he retraced the trail, he understood. The forest did not merely witness. It catalogued, memorized, and in its own inscrutable way kept what it deemed noteworthy. The clearing pulsed with a quiet life, invisible but undeniable, the memory of the night lingering in the angle of the rocks, the placement of the ash, the subtle weight of the air around him. His breath came in shallow gasps, and yet he walked steadily, guided by a trail that looked familiar but felt warped. Every time he glanced over his shoulder, the clearing seemed to shift just slightly, as though testing whether he noticed. Sunlight could not mask the subtle distortions. Shadows that clung to nothing. Tree trunks that appeared longer than logic allowed. Rocks that seemed to lean in ways they had not the day before. Even leaving did not erase his presence. The forest remembered, and in remembering it marked him. At the trailhead he paused, finally able to see the forest behind him. To any ordinary eye, it was just a clearing, quiet and unremarkable, yet he could feel it. The echo of night footsteps, the silent arrangement of ash, the lingering gaze from the trees, the memory of the patterns, the footprints, the faces in the camera. These were not just hallucinations, they were permanent signatures in the consciousness of the forest. He could not undo what had been recorded. He could only leave, carrying the weight of that observation with him. Even as he descended toward the road, the clearing remained alive in his mind. Every photograph, every step he had taken, every glance at a shifting shadow played in loops, reminding him that leaving the physical space did not equate to leaving its memory. He understood, finally, the warning whispered among locals. The forest rearranges those who linger too long. It does not need to touch them to leave a mark. It does not need to speak to imprint terror. Presence alone is enough, and memory alone is its tool. By the time he reached the trailhead's edge, the forest had receded into the distance, appearing calm, silent, and entirely ordinary. Yet he knew better. The clearing would always remember. It would wait for the next visitor, catalog their movements, shape the night, and silently imprint their essence into its patterns. And he, despite the sunlight and the road ahead, would forever carry the knowledge that some places are alive in ways beyond comprehension, and that some nights are never truly over. Route 13. The night was heavier than usual when he turned onto Route 13. The highway stretched into darkness, the headlights cutting ribbons through the black, but nothing beyond their reach existed, or at least nothing that he could see. The air was thick, wet, and cold, clinging to his skin and muffling the world around him. He could smell the faint, metallic scent of the road, the sharp tang of tires burning lightly against asphalt, and yet it felt distant, muted, as if the fog itself absorbed reality before it could reach him. It started subtly at first. A haze appeared ahead, hovering in the headlights like smoke curling from an invisible flame. Odd, he thought. The mist stopped exactly where the beams touched it, leaving the rest of the road untouched. He blinked, shook his head, and pressed on. But the fog thickened, dense and clammy, swallowing the line where the asphalt met the horizon. Every tree along the roadside seemed closer than it should have been. Limbs brushing the edges of the lights, leaves rattling without wind. Fence posts leaned at impossible angles, their shadows stretching unnaturally. The rhythmic hum of the engine was the only sound, a low vibration that seemed to echo the beat of his own heart. Occasionally, the tires rasped against worn asphalt, each screech sharper than expected, bouncing off the fog like a signal he couldn't interpret. He realized he was gripping the wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles pale in the dim glow of the dash. Every instinct told him this was a road he knew, a path traveled countless times, yet every detail, every line of paint, every curve of the shoulder, felt wrong, alien, reshaped by something he could not name. Then came the pause in motion. Up ahead, shapes began to emerge in the mist. Not yet figures, only distortions of shadow and light, vague impressions that seemed suspended mid-step. He thought perhaps they were trees, perhaps a trick of the beams, but the shapes lingered, bending and shifting as if alive. The fog clung to them, turning edges jagged and impossible. Each step forward felt heavier, the air thicker, and for the first time, he realized he was not just driving through the fog. The fog was moving with him, forming ahead of his headlights as if it were aware of his passage, anticipating him. He tried to focus on the familiar landmarks, the old road signs, the curve of the next hill, but they were all slightly wrong. Distances shifted. Trees loomed unexpectedly. The fences that should have paralleled the road wavered and bent toward him. A cold sweat prickled along the back of his neck, and a creeping unease settled low in his stomach. He wanted to rationalize it, to tell himself it was just fog, just night, but the shapes, the unnatural proximity of the trees, the almost sentient way the mist formed in front of the truck, none of it could be explained. Time felt distorted. Each second stretched and compressed as he moved forward, the headlights carving a path that existed only for him. The world beyond the beams was empty, silent, watching, waiting. He realized he wasn't merely on Route 13 anymore. He was somewhere between the road and the fog itself, suspended in a space that obeyed no rules he could understand. Every breath he drew felt thick, almost visible, pressing against the constriction of his chest. The ordinary night had vanished, replaced by a tense awareness that the road he had known for years had become something else entirely, something alive, patient, and impossibly intent on holding him within its mist dot. And as the headlights carved another stretch of black ahead, the fog coiled and shifted, forming shapes just beyond recognition, and he knew, without understanding how, that nothing ahead was ordinary, and nothing behind him would remain the same. The shapes appeared slowly, first as shadows flitting at the edge of his headlights, barely discernible from the dark roadside, and he thought he was imagining them, the fatigue of a long night playing tricks on his eyes. And then they solidified, frozen mid-step, figures standing along the shoulder, rigid and impossibly still, their outlines human but lacking detail, features blurred as if the fog itself refused to let him see them clearly. Each time he blinked, they seemed to shift slightly, their positions realigning just enough to make him question whether they were statues, illusions, or something more deliberate, something that existed only to watch him. He slowed the truck, and that's when they moved, slow, deliberate, advancing toward him in perfect synchronization with the turn of his wheels, as if the road itself dictated their pace. The sound of tires on asphalt became almost deafening, each rotation punctuated by a tension in the air, a rhythm that matched his pulse, and for the first time he realized he was not alone on Route 13, though no one had to speak to make him understand. The figures did not wave, did not call, did not blink. They simply stepped forward, synchronized with his speed, each motion smooth yet impossible, their shadows stretching unnaturally beneath the fog, twisting against the light in ways that broke geometry and reason. Every attempt to accelerate seemed futile, as if the fog, the figures, and the road had conspired to hold him in place, to force him to witness what he could not escape, to remind him that the night was no longer his own. Panic rose slowly at first, a creeping chill that crawled along his spine, settling into the muscles of his neck and shoulders, and then faster, hammering against his chest like the echo of the tires on the asphalt. He reached instinctively for the mirrors, checking the back, the side, anywhere for another perspective, and found nothing. No movement, no glint of eyes, nothing to explain the sense of scrutiny pressing from all sides. Yet the feeling persisted, as if the figures were not just beside him, but behind him, inside him, anticipating every decision. The world outside the headlights became a void, the edges of trees and fence posts swallowed by darkness, leaving only the unnatural forms advancing, the fog coiling around their legs and melting into the road behind them, a soft hiss of dampness accompanying every step. His hands tightened on the wheel until knuckles whitened, fingers trembling as sweat dripped down his temples, cold and metallic against his skin, carrying the faint smell of the asphalt and the wet fog. Time warped again, each second stretching into a heartbeat that felt endless, dragging the figures forward in a relentless march that matched his own motion, a cruel reflection of the impossibility he could not comprehend. He tried to swerve, to pass them, to escape the pressure of their silent advance, and each maneuver caused the fog ahead to thicken, to swirl, to expand like a living entity refusing to let him leave, each attempt punished by the way the figures adjusted, always blocking, always waiting. He felt a nausea rise, a mental disorientation that clouded memory and anticipation, blurring the line between the road he knew and the impossible path he was trapped upon. The lights of the truck illuminated the shadows for only an instant before they dissolved into the gray mist again, leaving him questioning whether the figures had moved at all or if he had imagined the advance entirely. And as the truck hummed along the twisted stretch of asphalt, the shapes remained, unwavering, their frozen posture promising that any attempt at normalcy, any thought of escape, would only stretch the fog further ahead, forcing him deeper into the silent choreography of Route 13, a road that seemed alive, patient, and aware. And he understood then that the night would not release him, and that the figures, somehow, were waiting for the moment he realized just how alone he truly was. The fog thickened almost immediately, a wall of gray that seemed to ripple with every rotation of the tires, a living, pulsing mass that swallowed the edges of the road and left only the beam of the headlights cutting a tenuous path ahead. The figures had begun moving, stepping forward in perfect coordination with his speed, but now they were closer, larger, their outlines blurred and unstable, as if the fog itself was molding them to the rhythm of the truck, bending reality around their forms. He blinked, and a shadow stretched unnaturally, leaning toward the cab before receding again, the edges smudged as if painted with wet charcoal, shapes elongating and collapsing in impossible angles. Every attempt to drive past them, to accelerate and leave the roadside behind, was met with a strange resistance, not mechanical, not even visible. Just the sense that the road itself was alive, curving ahead to trap him in a corridor of fog that stretched farther than any map could contain. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the rhythmic hiss of tires rolling over wet asphalt, and the fog seemed to pulse with each beat, growing denser, more oppressive, hiding and revealing the figures in alternating waves. In the headlights' glow, their movements were hypnotic, uncanny in their precision, a synchronized dance that had no beginning or end, as if time itself had fractured along the ribbon of Route 13, leaving him to drive endlessly in a space that obeyed no laws he had ever known. He swerved instinctively, trying to break the rhythm, and the fog responded, thickening ahead, rolling in like a tide, and the figures matched his change of speed, adjusting their advance, closing the distance even as he pushed harder. The air inside the cab felt thicker, almost viscous, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and wet leaves, mingled with something sharper, metallic, like blood carried on the wind, though no wound existed to explain it. His hands ached from gripping the wheel, knuckles tight, sweat slicking the leather as adrenaline surged through him. But nothing slowed the figures. Nothing altered the relentless, precise way they moved. Even the familiar sounds of the truck, the engine hum, the tire friction, shifted in the fog, distorted into a low, pulsing rhythm that seemed synchronized with their advance, as though the road itself had become a conduit, feeding him the tempo of something older and patient, something aware. Every glance to the mirrors, every turn of the head, revealed nothing definitive, yet the presence persisted, intangible and heavy, pressing in from the sides and the rear, impossible to quantify, impossible to escape. He could see glimpses of legs, torsos, shadows folding into one another, dissolving into the fog and then solidifying again when the light caught them just so, a cruel tease of form and motion that made the brain strain to process it. Panic clawed at him, raw and persistent, a living thing in his chest, threatening to undo every thought, every attempt at rationality. He tried reasoning. Maybe animals, maybe hallucinations from the long night, but the synchronicity of the steps, the precision, denied explanation. The road twisted subtly beneath the fog, each turn bringing him back to the same stretch, barns and fence posts repeating in impossible sequences, each attempt to escape only extending the relentless chase. And always, just ahead, the shadows waited, fluid and unreadable, their pace tied to his own, the headlights unable to penetrate the thickening veil, leaving only the impression of forms chasing him, leading him, corralling him, bending reality into a loop with no exit. As the minutes dragged, each second stretching into eternity, he realized that the night would not release him, that Route 13 had claimed the space between his headlights and the horizon, and the figures were not chasing him so much as they were guiding him, orchestrating a path he could never fully understand, a path that promised the end was just a few heartbeats ahead, though he had no way to measure the distance or the time. And as the fog enveloped him entirely, the shapes in the headlights became the only certainty in a world that refused certainty, a cruel, impossible certainty that he was not moving at all, and yet could never stop. Every turn of Route 13 became a cruel repetition, barns and signposts appearing again and again as if the road itself had forgotten how to lead anywhere new. He tried to track his progress, compass, GPS, odometer, but every instrument betrayed him, spinning and flickering, contradicting what his eyes told him, insisting he had traveled miles when the scenery repeated itself, insisting he was stationary when the curves suggested motion. The fog pressed closer now, curling around the edges of the truck, muffling sound, muting engine noise, isolating him in a corridor that refused exit. Each familiar landmark felt wrong, too close, too far, angles subtly off, edges of fences bending in ways the mind should have rejected, and yet he could not deny the reality of what he saw. A creeping vertigo took hold, a sense that he was moving endlessly through a loop that had no start or end, that each mile traveled was simultaneously progress and regression. The repetition itself became oppressive, a slow, grinding horror, as if the road had become a living thing, conscious of his presence and unwilling to release him. Shadows along the roadside stretched unnaturally, elongating in ways that made him flinch, then disappearing entirely when he tried to focus on them, leaving only the sensation of being observed, of the fog itself bearing witness to his confusion and fear. Panic began to thread through his thoughts, fraying focus, making every decision feel uncertain, every turn a gamble in a corridor that defied logic. He pressed the accelerator, desperate to break free, but the road subtly curved back, leading him once again to the same cluster of barns and fence lines, repeating as though mocking him. Tires spun over asphalt that should have held his tracks, yet no marks remained. Every indication that he had been there, every trace of his passage, vanished like it had never existed. Time warped in the fog, minutes stretching into what felt like hours, seconds sometimes compressing to a heartbeat, leaving him unable to measure how long he had been trapped. The truck became both his prison and his instrument of torment. Each motion met with subtle resistance from the road, as if the asphalt itself were shaping him, guiding him along an impossible path. Every glance into the mirrors revealed nothing, yet the feeling of presence, watching, measuring, controlling, remained. Impossible to escape, intangible yet undeniable, and with each passing curve, each repeating landmark, he understood a horrifying truth. The road had abandoned any connection to the world he knew, that the geography itself was subordinate to something older and patient, something that refused release. He could no longer trust his memory, his instruments, or the very logic that had always guided him. Route 13 had become a corridor of impossibility, a stretch of asphalt that moved in on itself, and he was trapped inside, a solitary witness to a world that would not obey the rules he had always lived by, a world where the path forward was a mirror of the path already traveled, and the end could never be reached. The cab felt heavier that night, though he was alone, or so he told himself. A presence settled beside him, subtle at first, an unshakable weight in the seat, like the air itself had thickened, pressing against his ribs and shoulders. The fog outside seemed to lean in closer, curling around the truck in slow, deliberate waves, muting the engine, muffling the tires against the asphalt, leaving him in a bubble of suspended reality. He caught glimpses of them in the mirrors, figures half seen, fleeting, just at the edge of reflection, shifting slightly when he dared to blink. No detail ever held. They were there and not there at once, forms composed of mist and shadow, impossible to track with certainty. Every time he tried to glance directly at the empty seat beside him, he found nothing, yet the sensation remained. Something was watching, studying, measuring, patient and silent. The rhythmic pulse of the engine seemed to sync with an invisible heartbeat, and for a moment, he felt as if the truck itself had taken on life, guiding him, steering him, keeping him aligned with the fog's slow expansion. Shadows stretched along the road ahead, moving just beyond the headlight's reach. Shapes that hinted at humanity but twisted impossibly at the edges, limbs and angles shifting as if the very air were bending them into forms meant to unsettle the mind. Each attempt to speed past, to accelerate into some imagined freedom, met with resistance. The fog thickened, closing in, filling the cab with a damp chill that made the hair on his neck rise. Reflections in the side mirrors teased him further. Passengers that disappeared when looked at, only to reappear seconds later in different positions, as though the space inside the truck was elastic, folding, stretching, holding them in impossible geometry. He could feel their awareness, a quiet, almost sentient pressure that mirrored his own panic. The road had become a living trap, the mist a sentient presence, and he was a solitary traveler at the mercy of forces he could neither name nor understand. Time fractured inside the truck, seconds elongated, then compressed, leaving him disoriented, unable to measure distance, speed, or duration. The faint metallic smell of the cab's interior, oil, sweat, cold steel, mixed with something else, something heavier, oppressive, like iron and fog intertwined. Every turn of the wheel seemed guided by unseen hands, as if the road and the passengers inside were in perfect communication, orchestrating a movement he could not oppose. His heart thudded in erratic patterns, echoing through the cabin, each beat mirrored by creaks, murmurs, and soft shifts from the unseen companions. And always, the mirrors betrayed him. Glimpses of what shouldn't exist, figures poised to vanish the instant he sought clarity, a reminder that he was never truly alone. He knew then that the cab itself had become a threshold, a conduit for something patient, ancient, unwilling to release him from observation. With every mile, the fog, the reflections, the subtle weight beside him, all converged into a single, undeniable truth. The road was alive, and he was no longer the driver, only a participant, watched, catalogued, and trapped in a slow, suffocating awareness that the fog itself had claimed him. The cab, the mist, the silent passengers, they were all extensions of the same impossible force. and he could do nothing but continue forward, caught between fear and inevitability until the morning might, or might not, bring escape. By the time he realized the logbook was open on the passenger's seat, a creeping dread had already settled into the marrow of his bones. The truck idled softly, fog curling around the tires like smoke from a slow-burning candle, and the pages before him were no longer blank. Words sprawled across them in the handwriting that was not his own, precise and deliberate, yet describing every detail he had only half remembered or hadn't consciously noticed at all. The fog in the headlights, the figures frozen on the roadside, the subtle pressure in the empty seat beside him, all catalogued in perfect, unnerving clarity. He traced a finger over the ink, half expecting it to smear, to dissolve like wet charcoal. But it remained stubbornly permanent, as though etched not on paper but into some deeper record of the night itself. Each line detailed his journey in ways his memory could not, echoing the terror of his own perception and twisting it into certainty. The entries included minute observations he had not registered consciously, the trembling of his hands on the wheel, the way shadows pooled in the mirrors, the heartbeat that seemed to echo through the fog in the cab. He flipped pages, and every entry progressed chronologically, yet time itself felt fractured, compressing hours into moments and moments into hours, as if the road had rewritten reality to accommodate its own narrative. His attempts to reconcile what he had done with what had been written became futile. Every rational explanation crumbled under the weight of the evidence the logbook presented. Accelerating or braking, turning the wheel sharply or easing it, each movement left no trace outside the truck, yet inside, the events were meticulously recorded as if the road itself had witnessed and remembered his every action. The fog outside moved in tandem with the sentences, curling higher, denser, pressing against the windows, and the figures in the roadside shadows seemed to glance toward him, knowing he was reading their account of events that were both past and ongoing. The air in the cab thickened, warm and damp, carrying a faint metallic tang, mixing with the smell of ink and paper, forming a strange, almost organic presence that seemed aware of his panic. He tried to close the book, to shove it aside, but it remained open, pages rustling softly even though the truck was still. Every time he looked up, the mirrors offered glimpses of the silent passengers, uncatchable in direct view, yet unmistakably there, their presence threading through the fog, threading into the words that chronicled him. The boundary between memory and documentation blurred. He could no longer tell whether the events written were memories of what had happened or prophecies of what was to come. The road itself had become a scribe, indifferent and omniscient, and he was merely the subject, a vessel through which the narrative was poured. A low shiver ran through his spine as he realized the logbook's ink was not just recording, it was anticipating, detailing nuances that had yet to unfold, events that would only exist because they were already written. The cab hummed softly with the tires against the asphalt, but beneath the hum was another rhythm, a quiet metronome that seemed to echo the timing of each line, each observation, syncing the world outside with the page before him. Panic swelled in his chest, a heavy, suffocating tide, as he understood with a clarity that was impossible to deny. The truck, the road, the fog, the silent watchers, they were all complicit, and he was trapped in a night that had begun before he arrived and would continue as long as the logbook demanded. He dared not close it, for fear that doing so would erase the only record of reality he had left. Yet leaving it open felt like leaving a window to something alive, something that saw him with every glance and measured him with every heartbeat. And as the fog thickened, pressing closer to the glass, blurring the road and the shapes within it, he realized that the logbook was not merely a record, it was an extension of the road itself, an instrument of the night, writing him into a story he could not escape, where memory and writing converged into a single, unyielding truth. When the first hints of light began brushing the horizon, the fog dissolved like a half-remembered dream, leaving the highway silent and bare, as if the night had never existed at all. The figures, the shadows, the mist that had clung to him for hours, they were gone, vanished without trace, and the asphalt stretched empty in every direction, smooth and unbroken, untouched by tires or footsteps. His hands tightened on the wheel as he tried to reconcile what he had experienced with the calm reality before him, but nothing made sense. The roadside was ordinary, the trees still, the air clear, carrying none of the oppressive weight that had driven his fear into a living rhythm. The logbook sat on the passenger's seat, a quiet monument to the impossible night. Its pages were filled with the details he could not have known, events he had only half lived, yet each line was precise, undeniable, a record of a Route 13 that now no longer existed. He opened it again, tracing the ink with trembling fingers, but the entries felt heavier under the dawn light, as though the daylight made them more real, more insistent, whispering that the road had been alive, aware, recording every motion, every heartbeat, and he had been caught entirely within it. Every instinct urged him to leave, to drive until the ordinary landscape reclaimed him, yet his body moved sluggishly, weighed by a dread that refused to lift. The rearview mirror reflected nothing unusual, yet he could not shake the feeling of being observed, as though the memory of the fog, the figures, and the unseen watchers was etched into the very air, lingering invisibly behind him. Step by step, he walked to the roadside, expecting to see remnants of the impossible night. Tire tracks, disturbed gravel, the faint shapes of the figures frozen mid-step. But there was nothing, only the highway and the quiet sunlit trees. And yet, when he glanced at the logbook one last time, the ink shimmered faintly, just enough to make the letters pulse, as though alive and aware that he was watching, still recording, even now. He realized then that Route 13 had not vanished from memory alone. It had disappeared from the world itself. A phantom road that existed only in the intersection of his fear and the pages he could not control. Every rational thought he clung to unraveled as he tried to imagine how a highway, solid and permanent in every map and record he had known, could be erased so completely, leaving no evidence beyond the unyielding documentation of the logbook. His reflection in the side mirror caught him off guard. A man older, more worn, with shadows beneath his eyes that hadn't existed the night before, as if the experience had imprinted itself physically, accelerating time in ways he could not explain. The air carried the faintest echo of the fog, a memory of damp mist and the whispers of figures at the edge of perception, threading through the light morning breeze and into his skin. He tried to convince himself it was over, that the highway had released him, but a sense of unease remained, subtle yet unrelenting. A hum beneath his consciousness, a warning that what had been recorded in ink would continue to follow, even if the road no longer existed. Each step away from the truck, each glance back toward the asphalt, brought the same suffocating certainty. He had survived the night, but he had not left it behind. Route 13, the fog, the silent figures, they were gone from the world, yet not gone from him, embedded now into memory and flesh, lingering like the last wisps of mist that refused to dissipate, a road that existed only in the space between fear and reality, a story he would carry indefinitely, untouchable, unexplainable, eternal. Night call on Hollow Ridge. I reached the ridge just as the last traces of daylight slipped behind the hills, leaving the sky in that brief, unsettling lull between blue and black. The road behind me had fallen silent miles earlier, and the wind carried only broken mechanical creaks from the tower above, like it was shifting in its sleep. I'd been out to this site before, but the isolation felt heavier this time, as if something had settled over the ridge since my last visit. Something patient and listening. The gravel under my boots sounded too loud as I walked toward the fence line. Every crunch echoed, lingering half a second too long, like the air was stretching the sound. The tower loomed overhead, its metal frame outlined against the dimming sky, red lights blinking steadily up its height. They usually brought a kind of comfort, predictable, consistent, but tonight they felt like slow, deliberate breaths. Inside the small control shed, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged in front of me, drifting across the equipment panels before disappearing. Everything smelled faintly metallic, mixed with the cold plastic of old wiring. I moved through the familiar checklist, tapping meters, flipping switches, tightening a loose bolt here and there. Routine work should have steadied my nerves, but something felt slightly off-kilter, like a picture frame hanging a fraction unbalanced dot. The hum started about 10 minutes in. Low at first, barely more than a vibration under the floorboards. I assumed it was the old generator struggling to stay alive in the cold, but as I listened closer, the pitch wavered in a way machinery didn't, almost like breath moving through metal. When I stepped outside to check the exterior wiring, the wind had settled into an eerie stillness. No rustling brush, no insects, not even the distant birds that usually circled the ridge. The only sound came from the tower itself, faint groans rolling down its steel frame, as though it were shifting under some unseen weight. I climbed onto the first platform, gripping the cold railing. From up there, the ridge stretched in all directions, falling away into a dark, rippling sea of trees. But what caught my attention wasn't the forest, it was the air. Something about it felt wrong. Too still, too heavy, like the space around the tower was holding its breath. The hum deepened as I climbed onto the second platform. It wasn't coming from the generator after all. It was vibrating through the tower's structure, traveling up through the metal and into my hands. I paused, listening. The sound wasn't random. It pulsed in slow, deliberate intervals, almost like a distant engine, or a heartbeat. I checked the equipment mounted to the catwalk, tightening a set of screws and brushing dust off one of the receivers. Everything appeared normal, but the hum continued, rising and falling like it was working to form a pattern. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, scanning the ridge behind me. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. But the feeling of not being alone grew stronger with each passing second dot. By the time I climbed to the third platform, the sky had turned completely black, the only light coming from the blinking red beacons above and the faint glow of the distant valley far below. The tower felt different at night. Taller, emptier, almost hollow. The metal beneath me trembled ever so slightly, as though something inside the structure was shifting. I placed my hand on the main relay casing, and the hum fluttered sharply beneath my palm, almost like it reacted to my touch. A shiver ran through me, freezing me in place for a moment. I waited for the sensation to fade, but it didn't. The tower felt alive, subtly, quietly, as though something deep inside the metal framework was stirring. A faint crackle drifted through the air, a whisper of static carried by the wind that hadn't been there a second earlier. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, rising just enough to be noticed before dissolving again. I turned slowly, scanning the darkness around the tower. The ridge was empty. The tree line was still. But the static continued, soft and nearly rhythmic, trailing up the tower's height like an unseen presence climbing with me. I tried to shake it off, just interference, just the wind, just the altitude. But as I moved toward the next ladder, the hum shifted again, subtle but unmistakable. It sounded almost like a response. By the time I reached for the rung, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. The tower wasn't malfunctioning. It was reacting. And somewhere within that cold steel structure, something was waiting for me to keep climbing. The hum from the tower had settled into a low, almost expectant vibration when I returned to the control shed, tools in hand but nerves already fraying at the edges. The wind had died down entirely, leaving the ridge wrapped in an unnatural silence that pressed against my ears. I flipped the main switch on the receiver, expecting only static, the usual crackle and hiss of old wiring, but the sound that met me was different this time. Buried beneath the white noise, words began to form. First, a single coordinate, repeated over and over, mechanical in rhythm, precise yet entirely alien to me. I froze, letting the metal railing cool my palm while I strained to hear. Then another coordinate followed, layered over the first, each repetition deliberate, punctuated by the slight shiver of static that slithered along the edges of the frequency. I double-checked the circuits, convinced the equipment had failed. Maybe a misaligned frequency, a stray signal from some distant broadcast. But every panel, every meter, every connection seemed correct, untouched, ordinary, and yet the words continued, precise, mechanical, almost anticipating my inspection. They carried an unfamiliar weight, like instructions written for me alone, the cadence deliberate and unnervingly patient. I tried to dismiss it as a coincidence, some echoing signal bouncing through the ridge, but the tone was too controlled, too personal. It was as if the air itself was shaping the sounds, sending them directly into my ears, whispering them through the static that filled the room. I stepped closer to the receiver, pressing my ear near the speaker. The coordinates repeated in a quiet, deliberate monotone, punctuated by tiny cracks in the signal that felt like breaths, shallow and measured. And then the rhythm shifted. Between the words, I caught the faintest inflection of a name, my name, spoken so softly I could have imagined it. The hairs along my arms rose, and a tremor ran through my chest. I scanned the shelves, the panels, the empty space behind me, looking for anyone or anything that might be speaking. There was nothing, just the shed, the ridge, and the humming metal tower looming behind me. I tried to focus on the equipment, tracing each wire, reconnecting every loose connection. My hands moved with methodical precision, but the coordinates didn't pause. If anything, they seemed to grow sharper, the voice embedded in the static slipping past any attempt I made to mute or divert it. Each repetition was intimate, almost taunting. It spoke of angles I had adjusted earlier, of the time I had spent checking a particular relay, down to the minute. The words knew where I had been, the gestures I had made, as though the ridge itself were observing my every motion. A shiver ran down my spine as the static flickered and rose in volume, carrying fragments of other details that should have been private. My routine inspection felt suddenly exposed, trivial, almost meaningless. Every footstep across the concrete floor echoed too long, too sharply, as though the sound were stretched by the air itself, bouncing back at me with faint inflections of the voice. It was patient, almost testing me. Each repetition built upon the last, layering new details over the previous ones, constructing a rhythm I couldn't ignore, couldn't untangle. I stepped back from the receiver, fumbling with the power switch, but the static didn't waver. It seemed to follow me, curling along the walls, pooling in the corners, the words bending through the modal frame like smoke. I turned in a full circle, eyes straining into the darkness beyond the shed, half expecting some figure to emerge from the shadows. Nothing moved. No footsteps, no rustling of branches, not even the low hiss of wind. Yet the coordinates continued precise, intimate, growing heavier in tone, pressing against my chest. The sense of being watched was undeniable now, solid as the metal beneath my feet. I realized the tower wasn't just sending a signal, it was alive in a way I couldn't define. The static itself was deliberate, almost intelligent, and it knew me. Every adjustment I made, every gesture, every glance toward the ridge seemed to prompt another repetition, another detail, creeping closer, folding the night around me. I felt my heartbeat quicken, echoing in my ears, trying to match the rhythm of the words. But the voice didn't falter. It mirrored, anticipated, and eventually surpassed the natural cadence of my own fear. By the time I sat back against the wall of the shed, tools slipping from my fingers, I understood something I hadn't wanted to. The coordinates weren't random. They were precise instructions, meant for me, for this night, for this ridge. The static had become a language I didn't speak yet couldn't ignore, threading into my mind and mapping out movements I hadn't taken yet. The weight of it pressed me into the cold floor, a mechanical whisper in the dark, patient, deliberate, knowing every motion before it happened. And somewhere beyond the glass of the small shed, beyond the steel skeleton of the tower, I felt it. A presence waiting, listening, and smiling quietly at the precision of my fear. After hours of standing near the receiver, the night pressed heavier against me. The coordinates still repeated, mechanical and precise, but my attention shifted to the ridge itself. I climbed higher along the steel catwalk, each creak and groan of the tower echoing into the empty desert like a warning. From that height, the surrounding forest seemed endless, a dark sea of trees fading into the black horizon. That's when I noticed the lights. They weren't the distant glow of vehicles or towns. There was nothing out here for miles. These lights appeared scattered across the forest floor, arranged deliberately, almost geometrically, like stars mirrored in the woods below. At first, I thought it a trick of my eyes, reflections caught in the haze of my fatigue, but they shifted subtly as I moved. Each step along the catwalk rearranged them, turning them into arrows, lines, and circles, guiding my gaze toward the dense tree line. I could almost feel them urging me forward, whispering through the hum of the tower, beckoning me toward some invisible center dot. The air was colder up here, and every breath left a fog that hung like smoke around my head. I squinted through the darkness and thought I caught movement between the trees. Shadows stretched in ways that defied the moonlight, folding in and out of the brush as if anticipating my own motions. A low metallic whistle carried through the night, like the sigh of some hidden engine, but the desert was still. Only the lights moved. They pulsed faintly, syncing with the static that still crackled through the tower, echoing the coordinates I had been forced to memorize in the back of my mind. I leaned against the rail, gripping it tightly, trying to focus on logic. Maybe someone had been in the forest before me, setting up lanterns or reflectors to prank an isolated technician. But as I studied the patterns, I realized they weren't random or humanly placed. Some shapes were impossible to form by hand, angles too precise, symmetry too exact. And every time I blinked, the arrangement had subtly changed, realigning to some pattern that seemed to communicate directly to me. I began to feel a creeping disorientation, as though my sense of direction was being pulled by the lights themselves. I descended a few rungs to the mid-level platform, trying to retrace my path, but the patterns continued to shift. Circles opened and closed, lines intersected and broke apart, and the lights aligned toward a section of trees that looked denser, darker than the rest. My pulse quickened, and I realized my own shadow was being cast in strange angles against the tower, elongated and fractured. For a moment, I thought I glimpsed figures moving among the branches, not fully corporeal but reflected in the forest in some distorted, fleeting way. The static over the radio grew more insistent. It seemed to harmonize with the lights below, the coordinates now accompanied by low, drawn-out tones that vibrated through the metal catwalk and up my spine. The pulsing of the forest lights and the crackle of the transmission were perfectly synchronized, creating a rhythm that I couldn't escape. Every attempt to retreat, every glance downward, was anticipated. The lights would shift, forming new symbols like someone or something was reading my movements and responding in real time. I began to realize the implications. These lights were not just signals, they were a map, a language, or a warning. Each rearrangement seemed deliberate, coaxing me to look, to step closer, to follow the patterns like breadcrumbs leading me into the dark heart of the forest. The desert, so empty moments ago, now felt alive with unseen observation. The trees themselves seemed to lean toward the light, elongating shadows into impossible angles, holding secrets just beyond sight. My stomach churned as a creeping awareness settled over me. The tower, the static, and these lights were connected. The ridge wasn't just a location, it was a conduit. The forest below was no longer just trees, but a participant, an entity that moved and adapted, coordinating with the tower and the signals in a way that suggested intelligence. Every movement I made was mirrored, anticipated, and absorbed into the rhythm of the night. I felt the night watching me, and the forest lights were its eyes, forming and reforming, pointing, warning, daring me to step too close. I climbed down cautiously, each rung creaking under weight that suddenly felt heavier than before. The lights shifted again, forming an almost perfect triangle aimed toward a cluster of darkened trees where the shadows seemed to twist in unnatural patterns. I froze, hearing a faint whispering in the static, the coordinates now layered with syllables I didn't recognize, but felt as if I had always known. The wind carried the faintest brush of metal and ozone, the scent clinging to my clothes as though the forest itself exhaled around me. I knew then that the ridge and its lights were no longer just signals. They were an entity with patience, intelligence, and a focus that had settled entirely on me. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet I was rooted by the realization that something was guiding me, watching me, and orchestrating every motion without ever revealing itself fully. The patterns pulsed, waiting, anticipating, and I understood with chilling clarity. The night was far from empty, and I was no longer alone. The higher I climbed, the heavier the night pressed against me. The static on the radio, once a vague background noise, had grown insistent, deliberate, almost sentient. It no longer repeated only coordinates. Now it whispered my own actions, my own choices from earlier in the day. The simple motion of turning a wrench, adjusting a cable, stepping onto the catwalk, each was echoed back to me over the crackling frequency, precise and unnervingly accurate. I froze, the weight of the realization pressing down like a hand on my chest. Something, or someone, had been watching me all along. My breaths came shallow, clouding in the frigid desert air, and the tower's metal frame groaned beneath my weight as though protesting my intrusion. I tried to convince myself it was a technical fault, some glitch or feedback loop, but the whispering continued, now layering small, intimate details I hadn't shared with anyone. The twist of my keys in the truck ignition, the rhythm of my footsteps climbing the steel rungs, the exact time I'd taken my first sip of water hours ago. Each snippet of information was delivered in the same monotone cadence, mechanical yet deliberate, as if the transmission had learned my movements and memorized them to repeat with surgical precision. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind. I gripped the railing tighter, knuckles white, trying to measure logic against the impossible. How could a radio frequency know these things? My rational mind searched for an explanation. Security cameras, Nearby observers, a hidden accomplice? Nothing made sense. The desert stretched endlessly, silent and empty below. No vehicles, no footprints, no evidence of life other than me. And yet the radio described me perfectly, recounting my every action as if the tower itself had absorbed my presence and now reflected it back like a twisted mirror. I realized then that the line between my own decisions and the voice's predictions had blurred entirely. Turning to descend the catwalk, I saw that each movement was mirrored by subtle shifts in the lights below. Triangles, circles, and patterns pulsed in response to my steps, rearranging as though the forest itself were mimicking my actions, or guiding them. The rhythm of the static and the light formations created a feedback loop, each reinforcing the other, pulling me deeper into the tower's impossible logic. It wasn't just observation, it was manipulation. A quiet coercion I could neither fight nor understand. Every instinct screamed to retreat, yet leaving felt impossible. The static intensified, layering whispers over whispers, overlapping with the pulsing forest lights. My own heartbeat thudded in my ears, accelerating with the rhythm of the transmission, the sensation of being simultaneously hunted and observed, twisting the night into something almost tangible. The tower had become more than a workspace. It was a nexus, a trap woven into the desert and the trees, bending my perception of time and space. Each glance downward confirmed it. The lights below responded, anticipating my gaze, rearranging, directing, controlling. I attempted to silence the radio, twisting knobs and unplugging cables, but the whispers continued, spilling from the tower's speakers as if independent of any power source. They described my attempts to stop them, predicting my frustration, mocking my inability to escape. I realized, with a sinking sense of dread, that the voice did not merely know my actions, it knew my intentions before I acted, reading the smallest impulses, the subconscious choices my mind hadn't yet formalized. My thoughts felt exposed, transmitted across the air, broadcast back to me in a distorted echo that was both intimate and alien. The desert wind carried an acrid scent of metal and ozone, clinging to my hair and clothes, a reminder that the night itself had been altered around me. Shadows between the trees stretched unnaturally, bending toward the lights, forming silhouettes that mimicked human shapes but never fully resolved. I could sense them more than see them. Figures waiting, observing, patient, unblinking, integrated with the tower and the static in ways my mind could not rationalize. The tower's steel skeleton seemed to hum with purpose, each rung, each cable vibrating subtly as if alive. By the time I paused on the catwalk, sweat chilling against my skin despite the desert cold, I understood the full scope of the terror. The tower, the forest, the lights, and the transmissions were one entity, or at least a coordinated force, that had been aware of me since I arrived. Each motion I had taken, each adjustment of equipment, had been anticipated, mirrored, and recorded. Escape felt theoretical, impossible in practice because every step I considered was already accounted for in the twisted logic of the night. I lingered there, the radio repeating my own actions, the forest lights pulsing with eerie precision, and the static layering into an almost song-like cadence. The line between my own perception and the tower's control had vanished. I realized with a cold clarity that this place did not merely observe, it learned, adapted, and anticipated. And in that moment, suspended between steel and sky, I understood that some transmissions are never passive, and that some nights demand more than attention. They demand surrender. I stared down into the forest below, convinced that movement waited just beyond the edge of my vision. The shadows between the trees shifted in ways that made no sense, elongating, retreating, and then snapping back into place as though the darkness itself were breathing. Each pulse of light from the tower above seemed to draw the forest into focus, illuminating hints of shapes that vanished the instant I blinked. The desert wind carried a subtle rustle that wasn't quite the branches, a low susurration that danced around my ears like the echo of whispered names. Every instinct screamed that I was not alone. The radio crackled, the static now almost conversational, merging with the patterns of light to create a rhythm I could not untangle. I tried to descend, to escape the towering steel and the eyes that seemed to cling to me, but the forest below reacted to each step. Shadows stretched and folded in unnatural ways, mirroring my movements in a perverse mimicry. The pulse of the lights on the ground seemed to anticipate my gaze, shifting when I tried to look away, forcing me to confront the possibility that the trees themselves were aware, sentient, and patient. As I moved along the catwalk, my hand brushing against the cold metal railing, I felt an uncanny sensation of being followed from every angle. No single figure appeared, yet every sense I had screamed presence, something or some force that tracked me invisibly, calculating and precise. The whispering on the radio had shifted again, repeating not just my actions but my fears, almost taunting me with the exact words I hadn't spoken aloud. The tower's static no longer felt random. It was synchronized with the unseen observers in the forest. A continuous feedback loop of awareness and anticipation. I peered over the edge, trying to spot the source of the unnatural alignment of lights. Geometry had emerged in the tree line, triangles and circles that traced impossible paths, intersecting and shifting in ways that defied logic. My rational mind searched for explanations, drones, hidden installations, signal projectors, but none matched the precision or the timing. Every movement I made was met with a mirrored reaction in the forest, the trees and shadows bending as if responding to my very intentions. The air smelled faintly of ozone and dry earth, metallic and tangential, a scent that made my skin prickle as though the night itself were aware of my presence. I realized then that the forest was not a passive observer. It was engaged, interactive, anticipating my choices, my hesitation, my attempts to evade. Each step I took along the narrow catwalk was mirrored by some imperceptible shifting in the shadows below. The static and whispering coalesced into a single oppressive presence, pressing against my mind with a rhythm aligned to my heartbeat. I could not move without their acknowledgement, could not breathe without their reflection. It was no longer simply observation. It was control, subtle but absolute, bending the forest, the tower, and the air between into a single, incomprehensible mechanism. I hesitated, gripping the railing as the wind whistled through the lattice of the tower, the steel groaning softly under my weight. The patterns of light below seemed to pulse in sync with the radio, the flashes tracing lines toward me, toward the tower itself. Shadows elongated further, dark shapes stretching from tree to tree, creating the sense of a bridge between forest and tower. Every attempt to move downward, to retreat, was met with the shifting lights and the whispering voices that predicted each motion before I acted. It was impossible to tell where my own intention ended and the forest's manipulation began. The deeper darkness of the night settled like a physical weight over the ridge. I felt the pull of the forest, as if the trees themselves leaned toward me, stretching branches into angles that could not exist in normal geometry. The radio's static layered the sound of movement, footsteps that I could not place, faint rustlings that did not match my own or any animal's. Each pulse of light reinforced the presence, a silent reminder that my every move was tracked, catalogued, and anticipated. The forest watched not just my body, but my mind, reading each calculation, each hesitation, folding it back into the night. I realized then that escape would not come through movement alone. No step downward, no leap from the catwalk, no retreat into the desert would free me from their scrutiny. The forest, The tower and the radio had fused into a single observing entity, aware of the minutiae of my life, the precise rhythm of my actions, and the faintest tremor of my fear. My skin prickled, my muscles tensed, and yet I could not stop, could not look away, could not escape the sensation of omnipresent observation. I stayed on the catwalk, suspended between steel and forest, as dawn's faint light began to break on the horizon. The whispers persisted, softer now, but no less insistent, layered beneath the morning wind. The shadows remained, frozen in impossible positions, waiting. Every fiber of my being told me that the forest had not released me, that I was still within its awareness, and that some transmissions, some presences, would never end. By the time dawn finally touched the ridge, the world felt hollowed out, scraped clean of anything familiar. The first pale light spilled across the metal framework of the tower, revealing nothing but silence. No shadows shifting in the tree line, no pulse of geometric lights, no whisper threading through the static. It was as if the night had folded itself neatly away, leaving behind an empty shell of cold steel and desert wind. I stood at the base of the tower, hands trembling from hours of sleepless tension, trying to convince myself that everything I'd seen had been a trick of exhaustion. Yet, even as the sun crept higher, washing the landscape with a dull, indifferent glow, the unease clung to me like a second skin. Something had changed in the night. Something had watched, learned, and left without leaving a trace. I forced myself to finish the last of my required checks, the motions mechanical and hollow. Every bolt I tightened, every wire I inspected, felt like an echo of what I'd done hours before. Only this time there was no voice repeating the steps in perfect detail. No static threading through the air with my name hidden in its cracks. The silence was worse somehow, a vacuum where the hum of presence should have been. I couldn't shake the feeling that the ridge was holding its breath, waiting for me to leave. The tower loomed overhead, its metal cold and indifferent. But I felt eyes, unseen, unplaceable, still tracking me from places the morning light couldn't reach. When I finally powered down the auxiliary systems, I noticed the recorder blinking, an indicator that it had captured far more than routine tower diagnostics. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the play button. Part of me wanted to walk away, to leave the ridge without listening to a single second. But a deeper instinct, one rooted in a need to understand whatever had happened on that towering scaffold of steel, pushed me forward. The machine clicked softly, and the recording began, its first seconds filled with nothing but the soft hum of wind. Then the static crept in, slow at first, like it was sneaking back into my consciousness. The whispers followed. Not imagined, not misheard. Actual voices threaded through the interference. They tracked my movements with eerie precision. Footsteps that weren't mine echoed faintly in the background, matching the rhythm of someone, or something, walking the same metal walkways I had, but just a few seconds behind. At times, it spoke before I acted. The recording predicted my movements, narrated each shift of weight, each exhale, each moment of hesitation as though another presence had stood inches away, anticipating me. I felt the air thin as I listened, my heartbeat straining to keep pace with the memory of the night. The deeper I got into the recording, the harder it became to breathe. There were moments where the radio captured breaths that overlapped my own. Not perfectly synchronized, not delayed, but layered, as if two versions of me existed at once. The static turned rhythmic, remembering the cadence of my footsteps. Then came the fragments of speech. But this time they weren't coordinates or descriptions of my tasks. They were whispers I remembered hearing from the tree line, words caught just at the edge of hearing, now clear and deliberate. I could hear someone, standing beside me on the catwalk, whispering into the wind while I convinced myself I was alone. At one point, the recording picked up a distinct metallic creak, one I had dismissed as the tower settling, but the audio made it undeniable. The sound wasn't random. It repeated with intent, almost patterned, as if something had been climbing the tower with me, step for step, landing for landing. And yet, I had seen no one. No shape, no outline, no movement betraying the presence that the recording now laid bare. The realization pressed against my skull. Whatever watched me had been skilled enough, or unnatural enough, to remain invisible while being inches away. When the recording reached the moment just before dawn, the static changed. It deepened, softened, took on a resonance almost like breathing. And then, in a low, distorted voice that felt too close to my ear, it whispered a final sentence, one that stopped my breath cold. It repeated something I had never said aloud, something I had only thought in a fleeting moment of panic high on the catwalk. A private thought, reflected back to me with perfect clarity, as if the tower itself had dipped into my mind. The recording ended abruptly after that, cutting off with a sharp click that echoed in the empty room like a closing door. I left the tower without shutting the recorder off, the device still blinking behind me as if waiting to capture more. The ridge was silent as I walked to my truck, but I could feel the weight of unseen attention following each step. The desert wind carried a faint thread of static, almost too soft to notice, but enough to make my skin crawl. I drove away with my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see shapes moving in the dawn light. But the ridge remained still, watching, waiting. And even miles later, the static stayed in my ears, soft, persistent, reminding me that some transmissions weren't meant to be heard once. They were meant to follow,